Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Wheeler Centre and this afternoon's discussion of Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights. My name is Lili Wilkinson. I'm an author and academic, and here to talk about wild moors and tortured emotions with me is Alison Croggon. Alison is a theatre critic, a novelist, a blogger and a poet, and she has recently published Black Spring, a novel which is very much inspired by Wuthering Heights, and we will talk a little bit about that as well. Please join me in welcoming her to the Wheeler Centre.
Hi.
All right, so we might just start. Can you tell us a little bit about your first encounter with Wuthering Heights?
When we were talking earlier, I suddenly thought I must have read Wuthering Heights at school, but I have absolutely no memory of that. So maybe that was just an accident. And my first memory of encountering Emily Bronte at all was reading her poems, which I really adored when I was a romantic 13-year-old and still adore. And I didn't really read Wuthering Heights until my early 20s, I think. And I found it took me about 3 goes. It was one of those books where I tried and then I kind of gave up and then I tried again. And then I think it was about the 3rd time I was kind of hooked and couldn't put it down. I think it's one of those books that resists you a bit. And there's things in it that are quite difficult to kind of get your head around. But then once you do, it's a fairly overwhelming book, I think.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Some newcomers. I want to talk a little bit about Emily Bronte because I think she was certainly the most eccentric of the Bronte sisters, which is saying something. And I've got this little quote that her sister Charlotte wrote about her just after she died, which is this. "My sister's disposition was not naturally gregarious. Circumstances favoured and fostered her tendency to seclusion. Except to go to church or to take a walk on the hills, she rarely crossed the threshold of home. Though her feeling for the people round was benevolent, intercourse with them she never sought, nor, with very few exceptions, ever experienced." And I read somewhere that pretty much her only companion other than her family was her dog, which was quite aggressive and weird, and that she liked to wear a purple dress that she had embroidered lightning bolts on.
Oh, did she?
Which I think is just the most awesome image. You said before backstage that Emily is your favourite of the Brontes. Why?
Yeah. I think it's because there's something, as I said, I first loved her poetry, which is kind of purely passionate and very musical, and I responded very strongly to her work in that way. And then reading Wuthering Heights, compared to the other, I mean, I love all the Brontes, but compared to them, it's such a lawless book that allows these kind of anarchic energies into the narrative, and they are energies without inhibition, without kind of social control, and they're dangerous energies, and it's that kind of presence in the middle of something that is actually really repressive, and I think that was really interests me in her.
Yep, definitely. And I want to talk a little bit about those social restrictions in a bit. But the book sort of centres very much, or in every way really, around this incredibly intense relationship between Cathy and Heathcliff. How would you describe that relationship?
How would I describe it? It's a famous relationship for all the wrong reasons, I think, that Cathy and Heathcliff has been taken in popular culture, in film, in adaptations, to be like the kind of obsessive, passionate love. And when you read the book, what you discover is that it's Cathy and Heathcliff are both almost entirely selfish people, and they're obsessed with each other. I think it's a beautiful portrait of an obsession that is not about each of them actually loving or caring for each other, but I think at one point Cathy says it's a necessity, that Heathcliff is a necessity to her, like the ground beneath her feet, and so it's a much kind of more elemental and deeper and troubling kind of thing that then, and it's cruel. I think this is a very cruel book, Wuthering Heights. There are passages in there that are some of the cruelest that are ever written in literature, I think. And the relationship between Cathy and Heathcliff is of that nature. It's not meant to be romantic.
Yeah, and so can you see any scenario, any sort of alternate version of this story where they could have been happy together? Gosh,
I don't know. It never occurred to me to think of one when it hasn't. I mean, it's kind of like I think in that book that it's both of their characters. I mean, there's the social world in which they live, which is very important. The class division between Wuthering Heights and Thrushcross Grange is really clear in the book, and who has money, who doesn't have money. Those kinds of things Bronte is really aware of and plays with those all through the book. And sorry, I've forgotten the point of what I was talking about.
Is there an alternate universe where they could have been happy together?
Well, it's sort of like saying they'd have to be different people who lived in different times. Yeah. I think in this book they're so clearly a product of where they are as much as their own kind of, if you like, unfettered personalities. Because I think both of them are people who really challenge the social rigidities around them. They don't take a lot of notice. And they don't really care. Yeah. And I think that's probably a theme that is very consistent across all of the Bronte's work. Yeah.
So let's talk about Heathcliff. He's often been described as a Byronic hero. He's dark and he's brooding and he's mysterious and he's given to fits of rage and he's sort of handsome in a very kind of, dark sort of way. But lots of people seem to see him as this incredibly sexy romantic figure. What do you reckon?
Well, I suppose the first thing you have to acknowledge is there is something incredibly attractive about the bad boy. And, in popular kind of culture, the bad boy, Marlon Brando, Heathcliff, all these people are really sexy. And it occurs in the book. It occurs in the book as well, except that when Emily Brontë writes Heathcliff, she describes someone who is totally cruel to everybody except Cathy. And the thing about Heathcliff is he's a foundling. He's picked up by I can't remember his name.
Earnshaw.
Earnshaw, who adopts him, and it's generally assumed he's a gypsy. He's he's a street kid. And then he's treated with enormous cruelty, and you also think that he's been treated with enormous cruelty. So he's coming out. This isn't explicit in the book, but it's very implicit that he's coming from this background where he has been treated with great cruelty, and then in the book he is treated with great cruelty, especially by Hindley, and where there's some horrible descriptions of brutality against Heathcliff as well as others. And so what you see is someone who is so brutalised that the only person he's prepared to cut any slack for, and he worships, is Cathy.
And even then he's still pretty awful to her as well at times.
Yes, but they kind of accept that. That's part of the deal between them, because it seems to me at the same time fairly equal between those two. And so, so when Isabella decides she's in love with Heathcliff, this terrible, he exploits that. He hangs her poodle, which is one of the most horrible scenes in the book, and she is so she has this giant crush on him because he's so romantic, swarthy, and feeds into all those things. And then she hits the reality of what that actually means, which it means that she's going to be beaten up. He's violent towards her. And I think this is where Emily Brontë is really good. She's really realistic about what that brooding kind of hero figure actually is. He's also a miser. I mean, his insistence on money is, which is something that Cathy points out, is hardly romantic, but but you know, that she's totally unsentimental about his shortcomings, but she doesn't judge him. I mean, I think that's the other thing about the book, that none of the characters are judged by the author. They just exist within the book, and then it's for the reader to decide what they think of that moral difficulty, if you like. Because I don't think he's not inhuman.
No. He's just not very nice.
No, he's not nice.
He's not someone you really want to go out on a date with.
Yeah.
I want to talk about the reader, and I want to sort of talk about the early readers of this book, and I've got a couple of quotes from contemporary reviews.
Oh, yes, they're good.
They are good. The first one is from the Atlas, who said, "We know nothing in the whole range of our fictitious literature which presents such shocking pictures of the worst forms of humanity. There is not in the entire dramatis persona a single character who is not utterly hateful or thoroughly contemptible. Even the female characters excite something of loathing and much of contempt. Beautiful and lovable in their childhood, they all, to use a vulgar expression, turn out badly." And then there is Graham's Lady magazine, who went even further and said, "How a human being could have attempted such a book as the present without committing suicide before he had finished a dozen chapters is a mystery. It is a compound of vulgar depravity and unnatural horrors." What is it about this book that was so shocking at the time and is still shocking today?
Gosh, I think at the time it was, I mean, there is this really, it's a funny book because there are ways in which, you know, like when you read it and you think, it's, you know, it's not that well written. If you read it, you can see that all the characters, even those with, you know, Yorkshire accents, kind of sound like the same character. And you know, there's other things which it makes sense. It was Charlotte who said it's an accident of genius. You were saying earlier that there's these ways in which it shouldn't be successful as a book. It shouldn't work, except it does. It has this kind of compelling power that's you know, quite incredible. But it's and the crudeness and the strangeness of it is part of that power. Strangely, I think with a book like Wuthering Heights, it shows really clearly that great writing isn't about being perfect. It's about something that goes on in all the flaws and imperfections of the book that then creates something that's quite unforgettable. And that captures the imagination. So because it's like that, and it's quite sui generis, I don't think there's another book like it. It would have been a really foreign object in that universe, and it's still. I mean, I think the thing about Wuthering Heights is people keep trying to domesticate it and make it less strange, less cruel, less odd, and, you know, more perfect, if you like, than it actually is. But it keeps remaining being there, full of flaws, full of, you know, exactly what it is, and challenging all those attempts to domesticate it. It is a wild book.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and kind of goes a lot of the way to explain why people are sort of so intent on turning Cathy and Heathcliff's relationship into a romance instead of into something that was incredibly unhealthy and toxic. And that can't really be contained by any of our conventional ideas of love, which I think is very interesting.
Well, I think the thing about it is that part of the reason it's so compelling is there's something true in it as well, and something that you recognise and that is necessary. So our ideas of love as healthy, it challenges those as well. Maybe love isn't. Maybe love isn't, you know, like a projection of egocentricity and all those things that actually are the case. So it's constantly sort of prickling you to, you know, reflect back on the things you assume, like all good books do, I think, which can be uncomfortable.
Speaking of good books,
yes,
you wrote this book. See what I did there?
Good stick away.
Which is very much inspired by Wuthering Heights. Tell us about this book and about the connection between the two books and how that happened.
Oh, okay. Well, Black Springs kind of like, I don't know. I mean, it actually, the feeling in Black Springs comes from my long love for Emily Bronte's poetry, and that kind of, if you like, direct passion. And I'm fascinated in Wuthering Heights by all those 19th century books, by the storytelling. In Wuthering Heights, it's the story within the story. So you have this Chinese box idea of narrative in which nobody is reliable as a narrator. So I kind of stole that. I stole the idea of the relationship between Cathy and Heathcliff and reworked it with my two characters. And then I married that to a society which is a bit like 19th century Albania, which I read about, which is vendetta culture, where I don't know if you know how formally vendetta works, but it's very grim. If it's a male thing, though there are women, they don't exist in this book, but they are women who become men in order to carry on a vendetta. They go on for generations, and basically it's eye for an eye thing. Someone is killed, then someone else must be killed, and so on and so on and so forth. And in northern Albania, this stuff would go on. Until whole villages were emptied of men. And the other thing that fascinated me was that every time a person was killed, there were very strict laws about it, and they still exist in places like Georgia. There's a 40-day truce after a killing. These are very old laws, before the revenge can be taken, and then it's understood that revenge will be taken. Anyway, all of this interested me and kind of collided with the idea of Wuthering Heights. And it's a fantasy novel, so there's also magic and wizards. And because it's by me, it's also a kind of feminist look at the whole story. So that's basically what it is. And hopefully it's a story that you can read on its own as an enjoyable book.
It is.
I mean, you don't have to read Wuthering Heights to read that book, as some people have asked me, and hopefully it's just a good story.
It is a good story.
There we are. Listen to her.
I'm interested by this idea of feminism, because we talked about Jane Eyre here 2 weeks ago, and I think there is very much a case to be made that Jane Eyre is a feminist novel.
Oh, yeah.
Can we make the same argument about Wuthering Heights?
I don't know whether you call it feminist, though it has these very vivid, strong female characters, and I don't think there's any sense that women are in the... I think you get the sense that socially women have a place, but you don't get the sense that actually they're inferior, or it reinforces those things, and there is a pushing against those kinds of roles and limitations. So I don't think that's what's important about it, really.
Yeah, no, I agree.
Yeah.
I'm interested at the kind of the role that religion plays in the book, and there's that sort of incredibly intense kind of moment where Cathy talk about her dream, and she says, "Heaven did not seem to be my home, and I broke my heart with weeping to come back to earth. And the angels were so angry that they flung me out into the middle of the heath on the top of Wuthering Heights, where I woke sobbing for joy." What do you think and then there's also the character of Joseph, who is, sort of a horrendously, terrifyingly religious person, and if Bronte is casting any kind of judgment on any character, it's on him. Yeah,
that's true. Yeah.
So what do you think the role of religion is?
I think in Wuthering Heights it's present as... It is a nightmarish thing. I mean, it's the nightmare that Mr. Lockwood has right at the beginning about the endless kind of lecture and so on. It's. I think it becomes the place where all the limitations, all the things that repress people are most present, but it also gives Emily Bronte these fantastic kind of polarizations between heaven and hell. Eternal suffering, eternal delight, which both of them mix in Cathy and Heathcliff, if you like. They're both all at once, and so that paradox is something she really plays with through the book. Yes. And being damned. Yeah. Yep.
Definitely. It is very much a Gothic novel. There are pretentious dreams and visions and bleak, lonely castles and storms and moors and things. What other kind of Gothic tropes do you see operating in the book?
Gosh, you stumped me there. I can't think of any. I just went. You have some more.
I certainly noticed the sort of the the frequency of keys and locks.
Oh, okay.
And that sense of, and windows also, and that's the whole idea of like opening and closing and excluding and including, which I think is sort of very, very central, the idea of the people who are invited in and the people who are not. And apart from all of the kind of the social stuff about Heathcliff being excluded from society, I think there is also this sense that Heathcliff and Cathy's relationship is so intense that nobody else is invited into into that, and that nobody else can ever dream to succeed to something as big and emotional and pure. Which I think is incredibly Gothic.
Yeah.
Why do you think the book is called Wuthering Heights and not Thrushcross Grange?
You come up with all the tricky questions. Wuthering Heights is the kind of axis.
Yeah.
I mean, it is the centre, and it's described as the hearth, and it's this, when you first see it, it's this warm, roaring fire of a house in a way, as well as being in the middle of the bleakness of the moors. And so, yeah, it is the heart of the book.
And I want to talk about Thrushcross Grange, which is incredibly difficult to say out loud.
Hard to say.
It is seen, and the people who live there are seen as sort of being very calm, but also very kind of weak and insipid and ineffectual, and very conventional. And Wuthering Heights is wild and savage and elemental. And I do like it when Isabella and Edward are described as milk-blooded cowards. To what extent do you think Wuthering Heights is condemning kind of social norms and niceties?
Like I said, I think Brontë doesn't judge anybody. She's kind of, and that's one of the great strengths in the book, that she's, as the writer, just through the different eyes of her narrators, offering you this picture of all these different characters, and they are unreliable, all of them, or both of them, I should say, and so I don't think she's drawing any morals at all. There's the moral of the book in terms of the whole kind of generational tidying up that happens at the end, which I've never been quite sure about. And it kind of finishes with this, very beautiful, peaceful image of the characters slumbering in the quiet earth, etc. And there's all of that, but as if all that stuff has been tamed, but at the same time, well, for me, there's the sense that it hasn't. It's still present there, perhaps momentarily quiescent, but that scar or that trouble that's revealed through the book is always going to be there, and is part of the vitality of the life in that book. Yeah, and so yeah, I mean, there is that huge tension between the final kind of bucolic image of everyone being all civilised and being taught how to read and all that stuff. Yeah, and the new generation bringing peace, which is I mean, it always seemed a bit ambiguous to me, but I don't know whether. So there's an implicit kind of perhaps more, but the book somehow questions that at the same time. Yeah,
I always read the three tombstones and that incredibly peaceful scene, and like there's a lot of life in it. There's the wind kind of breathing through the grass, and everything's all nice and sort of so different to all of the storms and the rock and the horror of before. But I always sort of saw that as a kind of like a return to nature, that now they've sort of been absorbed into nature, and that nature is such an important part, and the sort of the idea of the land and the moors and the heath and everything is so important.
Absolutely.
And that now that they have that they've always kind of been trying to wrestle to be civilised and ignore the kind of the pull of nature, and that now that they're kind of in the ground, they've sort of become part of nature, and so they can just calm down a little bit because they're not being pulled away from it anymore.
It's also Mr. Lockwood observing this, which suggests that's what he wants to see. Yeah,
and I think Mr. Lockwood is such an interesting character in a lot of ways. Let's talk about him for a moment. That how a reliable narrator do you think he is?
Well, I don't think anyone in the book's reliable, but I mean, you sort of believe that character sees what he sees, and he describes it all for you. Yeah. And there's that amazing passage where he sees the ghost of Cathy, and the cruelty of him rubbing her wrist over the broken window is one of those unforgettable images. And so you understand that within Mr. Lockwood is this capacity for extreme cruelty, and which he won't acknowledge.
Yep.
And I suppose that's part of the ambiguity of the book, that Mr. Lockwood is probably as dubious as anybody else.
Yeah, and incredibly...
But he believes he's civilised.
Yeah, and he's incredibly arrogant. There is that moment where...
Oh, he's such a ponce.
He's very... Yeah, he's awful. Where he sort of goes, oh, well, you know, if Cathy had been my girlfriend, then everything would have been all right. She would have been totally happy. Which is so arrogant, and, you know, if only that... Yeah, I can imagine what would have happened if they'd actually met. In the ending, sort of, we sort of achieve this balance between the sort of the milk cowards of Thrushcross Grange and the kind of the wild craziness of Wuthering Heights with Cathy and Hareton, and that their relationship seems a lot healthier. They have this sort of balance of being not completely restrained. They're friends, they laugh together, they, you know, but she is exerting a civilising influence on him. She's teaching him how to read, but that they're certainly not as constrained as the previous generation of Lintons were, perhaps. Do you think it's a happy ending?
Oh, I think it's framed as a happy ending. And I mean, and it's certainly an idealised kind of image that you're left with of you know, the possibility of civilization, and but it is a return to kind of order. Like, you get the sense with Wuthering Heights that it's an orderly farmhouse into which is brought Heathcliff, and from Heathcliff's presence, that's where things fall to bits, because of the jealousy between Heathcliff and Earnshaw, and how you know, the cruelties that brings out, and then what follows from that, which is all destruction. So there is this sense that order that was prior is now being restored. So perhaps there is this sense of a natural order, but it's a natural order in which things have been revealed by that presence, if you like, and there are things within the characters that are implicit in all of them, actually. Yeah,
I think that's very true. Certainly in all of the visual, you know, the film or TV adaptations of it, and I've only seen a couple, but the way that those two buildings are shown is that Wuthering Heights always seems almost like a medieval castle, like it's all like heavy dark stone. That's right. Whereas Thrushcross Grange is always, you know, it looks like something out of a Jane Austen movie. Like it's, you know, all nice white plastered walls, and everything is all very clean and gilt and velvety. Do you think that is? Do you think that is reflected in the text? Do you think that is how Brontë saw them? I don't think there's actually a vast deal of, you know, physical descriptions of what the walls look like.
No, not really. But I mean, you do get that when Heathcliff and Cathy run away and look through the window, and they're kind of barefoot and wild, and the children inside are all kind of, you know, very proper, and it's like looking into kind of fantasy for Cathy and Heathcliff, and it's the first point where that glimpse of civilization parts them. You know, Cathy's taken in, he's thrown out as, you know, trash. So the division of class in that it's one of those moments, and it's a telling moment of what's allowed in and what's allowed out, and the destructiveness of that. So that would be pretty much a fair reflection of what Emily Brontë would have been brought up with.
I did a little bit of maths, and I'm pretty sure that Nellie and Joseph are the only characters in the book who live past the age of 40.
Oh, okay.
Everybody else dies.
Very thorough.
Although I was just trying to think about it, and I am curious to know whether, and this is, you know, not really something that we can answer, but your opinion on whether that kind of the frailty of the human body in this book, and it is very frail. There is lots of death in childbirth. It's never really mentioned, I don't think, what happened to Cathy's mum, the first Cathy. And there's lots of missing parents in all of the parts, and everybody dies in childbirth except for poor Isabella, and she might as well. And you know, Linton is very sickly. Do you think that this sort of frailty of the human body is something that is symbolic, or do you think it is more just reflective of Emily Bronte's actual life, in which everybody died of?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think that's just the reality in which she lived. I mean, the Yorkshire moors were a tough place to live. It's very tough. I mean, beautiful, but really tough environment, particularly then. There was a lot of poverty and disease, and people, I think 50% child mortality at that time for children under 5. You didn't expect your children to live necessarily.
No.
That's why people had lots of kids. And those were the realities of life. That, and of course the Brontes, you know, Emily died at 29 of consumption.
I don't think any of them lived past 35
either. They died incredibly young. And that was the reality. It was 50 expected age.
Cheerful.
Yeah.
On that cheery note, I'm going to pass over to you guys now for any questions that you might have. So we've got 2 lovely people with microphones, so stick up your hand. One here. Awesome.
In your point of view, what does Wuthering Heights mean to you?
The name. Wuthering's the noise that the wind makes. It wuthers around the building, so that's how I take the meaning, and it's on a hill, so it's on the heights.
And I think it's very it is very sort of dramatically evocative. It makes you think of, like, the heights makes it sound very isolated, and the wuthering, like, you can hear that kind of noise of the winds whipping around it, and it sounds cold and bleak
and very Yorkshire. You know.
Who else has a question? Yep. In the middle there.
Thanks for your speech. Do you think Emily Bronte is scared of romance in her novel?
Oh, that's a great question.
Yeah, it is a good question. Gosh, that's hard to tell. I mean, it's really hard to say anything about a writer from their writing, because you have to remember that writers are liars and make things up. So it's really dodgy to assume anything. But certainly she was a very private person, and I think certainly from what her sisters wrote about her, she was someone who loved very deeply and loyally and passionately, but romance was probably something she didn't encounter and perhaps didn't believe in. Perhaps she'd seen too much distraction.
I did read an essay recently that that sort of posited a theory that she might be sort of on the Asperger's spectrum, which I thought was very interesting.
Yeah,
and
that makes sense.
Yeah, she was definitely very socially awkward.
A lot of writers are, mind you.
Yeah.
Let's face it.
So, yeah, maybe it would explain a bit about the book.
She wasn't inhibited, though.
No, definitely not inhibited.
I mean, it's such an uninhibited book.
I don't think any of the Brontes were. I think they were all, very frank about these things, despite the fact that they obviously weren't necessarily experiencing them in their lives. Perhaps maybe because of that. Who else? Comments, questions, thoughts?
What do you think the main message of the book is? What would you take away from it?
I don't think books have messages as such. I mean, I think what I took or have taken from the book is a real sense of disturbance, that this is a book that says very much that in the centre of life and living, there are all sorts of really difficult and incompatible things that are part of us, and they're just there. And there's various ways of dealing with them, but they are part of being a human being and being alive, and just makes you more aware of those forces, I think.
Yep, there's two. There's one at the back there and one down here. We'll go down here first.
Do you think that Wuthering Heights shows that darkness is an inherent part of human nature?
Sounds like an excellent question.
There's a writer called Georges Bataille who is a French philosopher who formed a club during World War II in which everybody who joined had to kill themselves. Nobody joined, strangely. But he wrote a book called Literature and Evil, and one of the writers he talked about was Emily Brontë, because he said that he took Brontë as one of the people who looked at the extremities, which is why she's so interesting. She looked at the extremities of what it means to be a human being, and those extremities are the things that we often don't acknowledge about ourselves, but they are within us.
Sorry, have you got the spelling of that author's name?
Bataille. Yep.
Just wondering, you touched on Lockwood being a reliable narrator, but what about Nellie?
About
Nellie?
Being a reliable narrator.
Well, I don't think she's reliable either. You get this sense with Nellie that sometimes she's fudging and hiding things.
Yes, definitely.
Or misrepresenting. I think it's all up for question in that book.
And Nellie is certainly, whilst I think you're right in that I don't think Emily passes a lot of judgment on her characters, Nellie passes enough judgment on everybody.
She does,
for
yeah.
everybody.
It's true, yeah. And you know sometimes she's wrong.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Particularly sort of when, talking about Heathcliff as a small child.
Yeah.
She's very unsympathetic.
Yeah.
Up the back.
Do you think that in Wuthering Heights, the natural and the social world, like Bronte's trying to show that they must be in harmony?
I think that's what she'd liked to happen, and that kind of ending is where those things reach some kind of balance, I think, and that perhaps is what she thinks is ideal.
And that too far in either direction ends up in cruelty.
Yeah. And kindness is actually very important.
Yeah.
I think you can draw that she thinks kindness matters.
Yeah. One at the back, and then there's one down the front here as well.
Sorry, just about Nellie and her narration of what happened. Why do you think Emily Brontë sort of created that, where it's likely that Nellie is fudging some of the events that happen in the book?
I think because it's more fun. Like if you're just baldly narrating something, that's one way of talking about something. But if you have a character who has an opinion about everything, it gives you more kind of...
gives you something to push against.
Yeah, more kind of play, because you can write things that then the reader is invited to doubt or to differ with, or that's inconsistent with that, whatever I heard earlier. But and I think Nellie's actually a fantastic character in the book, and what you have is a totally consistent character through which you make your own judgments. I think that you begin to know who she is, and so you begin to see how she judges things, how she tells circumstance, and read through that.
Yeah. And she's a kind of a consistent point as well, because
yes.
She was around in both sort of generations, which I think is really important to have someone who was consistent for both of those.
Yeah.
Down front here.
She was first, and she's been holding her hand.
Oh.
Yellow.
You mentioned Joseph briefly before, and he's sort of a very, very extreme character, quite sort of religious and quite at odds with those around him. I was wondering, why do you think Bronte's chosen to sort of put him in there? What sort of role does he serve within the story?
I don't know. I mean, in the story, he's a means of pushing the cruelty as much as anything. He's also faintly absurd, and he's probably there because she knew people like him. Wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I think so.
I mean, that kind of, total fundamentalist, those people, well, they're still around, but, they would have been around then too.
Yeah, and it's certainly something that comes across, I think, in all of the Bronte's work. I mean, there's also equally kind of sort of the hypocrisy of the extremely religious. It's something that comes across very strongly in Jane Eyre as well. That, and I'm sure that, Mr. Bronte, was a reverend, and so they would have come into contact with, plenty of interesting characters through that, I would say.
Yeah.
Yep.
You said that you researched most of your book that you've written. Do you think when she wrote this book, do you think that she would have studied the society that she was in to actually get a better understanding, or do you think she just made most of it up from her head?
Well, I didn't really research. I read a couple of books that I was really interested in, and then this because it's a fantasy world, not an actual world. So, but it's inspired by things I've read or thought about. But I think that, and the other thing is that all the Brontes made things up as children. They had a fantasy world that they wrote about and made poems for. A lot of Emily's poems were written for Gondel, was it? And so, they've told stories. So this is a story that she made up using the material that she had around her, which was where she lived. I think it's that simple. Yeah. And she used the things that she knew and saw. There's all those beautiful natural descriptions. I think quite clearly drawn from her own life. But it would have been inflected through what she'd read as well. They read a lot.
And I think that she definitely was sort of despite the fact that she probably didn't actually talk to a lot of other humans, she was definitely like a studier of people, and that the other half of that quote that I didn't copy down was that Charlotte describes her as sort of knowing everything there was to know about all of their neighbours and all of the people. Even though she never spoke to them, she would hear stories about them and she'd ask a lot of questions and she'd talk about them a lot. So I think she was very interested in the way that people work. Yep.
Thanks for your speech. As an author, what do you reckon about the Jule narrator technique that Emily Bronte uses during her novel Wuthering Heights?
It's not even dual, really. There's even more than that. There's like six of them, really.
I really like it because there's two narrators. If there was one narrator, you would accept that as the truth. Because there's two narrators, you suddenly have two ideas of truth that call each other into question, and I think I like that a lot, and that's what I used in my own book because I liked it. And there's actually three voices in my book that are all completely different for that reason, that here's this truth, here's this other truth, and here's another one. I think it's a tremendously useful mechanism, but it's also kind of fun.
Yeah, I think that's really true, and it's interesting to kind of imagine what the story might have been like if it was from Cathy's point of view, or if it was from Edgar Linton's point of view. It would have been a completely different book.
Absolutely.
If it was, and I think it's interesting to think about those different, how a perspective can change a story so much.
Yep.
Thanks for the speech. Do you believe Bronte had any intention of it being perceived as a love story by readers?
I don't think so. I think she would have been staggered. I really do. I mean, I've got no basis for thinking that, but if you look at her description, of course, it's a love story, but the ways in which that love story is perceived, I think she would have thought were really dumb. As a romantic kind of story, because she wrote it so toughly and so unsentimentally. I mean, it's very passionate, but there's not 1 ounce of sentiment in her description of what goes on in that book. And, so she would have thought that was a misunderstanding, I think.
Definitely. Yep.
How important do you feel it is to read Wuthering Heights from a 19th century perspective? Because I know that in our study we've tried to stay away from labelling Heathcliff with sort of modern psychology terms.
That's a good idea, I think. I think that's a good idea in any book. Really good books do withhold judgment and, don't label. But I think the first thing is just to read it as a story about these really fascinating people in this really fascinating reality that's removed from ours, but it still has this, for me, really compelling vitality that's revealing, I think. You can't read it as if you're a 19th century person, because you're not.
But we also can't judge Heathcliff by our current standards of... Well, I mean, we can.
Well, how much do we need to judge him so much as maybe consider what he is, which I think is what the book invites you to do. It's not to judge, not to condemn, but just to look. And, and you cannot help but have an empathy for Heathcliff at times, no matter what horrific things he does. And quite rightly, because it presents him as a human being and a complex human being.
One last question before we run out of time.
Heathcliff goes away for a large part of the novel and returns without much explanation as to what he's been doing. What do you think he did during that time?
Well, she never tells you. He got rich. So he's seeing as Cathy has rejected him for being a primitive boy and not like Edgar, he's run off and become civilised and become rich. There's no point at which we ever learn, do we, really?
No, other than there is that moment where they ask somebody, isn't there a moment where somebody asks him, how did you get it? And he said the way that everybody does, by taking advantage of other men.
Yeah, so it's a bit dubious. But
yeah, I'm sure it wasn't by honourable means.
Yeah.
Because it just doesn't, I just can't imagine him, starting up a small business or something. Doesn't strike me as really in Heathcliff's thing. All right, well, please join me in thanking Alison for being with us today.
Thank you.